looking at who's here and cross-correlating the faces I recognize with the problem set exam grades that I recognize, it seems to me we have the wrong bunch of people. That is, this lecture is directed at those who got 0s or 5s or 10s out of 45 on the problem set part of the midterm, with the hope of keeping them from doing the same thing on the final exam, and thus putting themselves in C world or low C world or D world or F world, which is a serious risk, given that the midterm was nearly half problems, and the final will be nearly half problems as well. And it looks to me like we have a bunch of people who, for the most part, are 30 to 45 range, who actually understand at least the mechanics of what we've been trying to get you to do, if maybe not the why. And so the effect of this lecture is going to further widen the grade distribution, to increase its variance, to push people away from B minuses and Bs, either up to the extent you learn anything here, or down to the extent that people who ought to be here aren't, and so fall behind in relative terms. But those are the breaks. All you can lead a horse to water. You can't necessarily make it drink. Let's get started. Problem set 8 is now out and up on the web, although I forgot to attach its web address. Let me make sure to email that before I head off on my trip to Philadelphia and then to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And next week in section, we're going to be talking about the federal government budget. And in lecture, we're going to be starting the fourth of what I think of as the component areas of macroeconomics, budget economics. How it is that the government's budget as a whole affects the economy as a whole and the rate of long-term growth. And for section reading, your assigned reading is the Congressional Budget Office Long-Term Budget Outlook, written by Doug Elmendorf and his staff at the Congressional Budget Office, with an attempt to tell you what the long-run picture of the American federal government and its role looks like, and the big decisions that we collectively have to make. Decisions that we will make one more effort at trying to have now over the next month and a half, as Congress and the President butt heads against each other with respect to the budget for the remainder of the current fiscal year 2011, which runs until August 31st of this year, and with the first steps toward writing a government budget for the next year, the fiscal year starting in September 1st, 2012, fiscal 2012, and what fiscal 2012 means for the long run. Also coming out next Thursday will be the take-home assignment replacing the second midterm, which will be due April 19th at the start of the class, and which will be a combination of writing essay-like things and doing problems. But the essay-like things will be based on kind of the problems. Getting the right quantitative answers in part 1 is going to be essential to then writing the right interpretive stuff in part 2. So what problems are we going to ask you on the final, and why? And what equations are you going to be confronting on the final? What equations are we going to give you, and what do they mean, and why should you pay attention to them? There are kind of three significant areas of problems, the quantitative problems we're going to be asking. We're going to be asking depression economics problems, we're going to be asking growth economics problems, we're going to be asking inflation economics problems. I've been racking my head thinking of every single quantitative problem I might ask on the final and what equations you need to solve it. And for depression economics, I've come up with 6 equations, which should allow you to solve anything I'll throw at you, provided you are able to understand what they mean and use them. The first of which is simply the national income identity itself, the way we define real GDP, the way we take the stock of all the goods and services that are being currently produced in the country in this year, and by the circular flow principle, the volume of production is also the volume of income and the volume of sales, and divide that into 4 components: consumption spending by households, investment spending by businesses, government purchases by the government, and then the difference between gross exports, purchases of our exports by foreigners, and imports, purchases of foreign-made goods by households, businesses, and the government here at home. That I think is fairly obvious. That's a very basic and fundamental equation. You're going to have to use it. Second comes the income expenditure model equation. It springs from the fact that a bunch of terms in the national income identity depend on each other. That is, what the level of consumption is plays a key role in determining the level of real GDP. More consumption spending means more real GDP. But a higher level of real GDP also causes more consumption spending, as households with more incomes are likely to open up their wallets and spend a bit more on goods and services. That means that if you try to use this equation here to calculate what the level of real GDP is from a bunch of pieces of disaggregated information, you're going to get into big trouble. You're going to calculate what consumption spending is, you're going to add up the other things, you're going to get a level for real GDP, you're going to say, wait a minute, when I calculated consumption spending, I assumed real GDP was something different than it turns out to be. I've got to go and I've got to feed that new level of real GDP back at the consumption spending and calculate consumption spending again. You calculate it again, you add up all the components, you get a new number for real GDP, and it also is not going to be consistent with the assumption you made in calculating consumption spending. The way to cut this particular knot is to say we're going to focus on those components of spending that do not depend on real GDP. We're going to calculate those, we're going to add those up: investment spending by businesses, government purchases by households, gross exports, purchases by foreigners, and that part of consumption spending that depends on consumer confidence rather than on the level of income, that baseline level of consumption spending. We're going to add up these 4 things and call them autonomous spending, and then we're going to take account of the virtuous or vicious circles and the reverse causation running from levels of income back to spending by means of this idea of the multiplier. We're going to calculate the multiplier. We're going to calculate the multiplicative inverse of this set of terms here. 1 plus the marginal propensity to import, the share of each extra dollar in income that's spent on imports, minus the propensity to consume out of disposable income, the marginal propensity to consume times the share of total income that's disposable income because it's not taxed away. Calculate that, take its multiplicative inverse, that's the multiplier. Simply multiply autonomous spending by the multiplier. You get the level of real GDP. You don't have to worry about reverse causation anymore. This is an algebraic trick that goes back to Richard Kahn writing in Cambridge, England in 1931 and 32. Although the Swedes say it actually goes back to Knut Wicksell writing in the 1890s, but he wrote in Swedish, so virtually nobody read him, and it's not quite clear in Swedish what's going on, or maybe that's just a bad translation. But we've been using it since, and it's still a very useful thing to have around. The third equation that you're going to need for depression economics is a reformulation of the income expenditure equation. Call it the investment savings equation. This we owe to British economist John Hicks back in 1937. And it's to say we're going to take the 4 components of autonomous spending, and we're going to add them up, and then we're going to divide them up into a different way. We're going to divide them up into those components that depend on the long-term real interest rate, times the long-term real interest rate. Some of investment spending and some of exports depend on it. This is a combination of some of investment spending and some of exports. We're going to divide them up into government purchases, and we're going to divide them up into everything else, into baseline autonomous spending. And the investment savings equation is essentially the same as the income expenditure equation, but you've just taken the numerator and you've split it up in a different way. You've split it up in a different way that's very helpful if you're considering government policies, either fiscal policy or monetary and banking policy, because you don't then have to run through and say, what's the effect of interest rates on exports, what's the effect of interest rates on investment. It's just right presented to you. You take baseline autonomous spending, you add government purchases, you subtract off the interest-sensitive components of the rest of autonomous spending, you use the multiplier, you get the level of real GDP. That's also something you're going to have to do. And you're going to have to do a few manipulations with what the long-term risky real interest rate is as the sum of four components. The short-term safe nominal interest rate the Federal Reserve controls, the term premium, how much people are willing to pay or feel they have to pay because they don't trust the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates at their current level, a risk premium because people don't like to bear risk, and then because what businesses care about is not so much how many dollars they have to pay in interest, but what goods and services will they be able to sell and at what prices, you then have to subtract off the expected inflation rate to get the long-term risky real interest rate. Knowing this equation, so you can substitute it back into this equation for R when necessary, is going to be a useful thing to know. Also, Okun's law. Right, the difference between the unemployment rate and its natural rate is half the percentage difference between between the ratio of actual to potential output. Or to calculate the growth of the unemployment rate, take the proportional rate of change of output, subtract 2.7% for long-term potential growth, multiply that by 0.5, and there needs to be a minus sign in there. Can I add a minus sign in there, or is this one of the places where I took a screenshot? And so I can't. Let's see. The terrifying thing is that Joe Stiglitz still does it. No, I can't change it here. I'll change it later on. That Joe Stiglitz still does this, and he's approaching retirement age. And the idea that you spend your whole career without getting good enough at this to avoid dropping minus signs is really depressing. The minus sign is supposed to be in this last equation here, that when output is faster than 2.7%, unemployment goes down, and not up. God, this is embarrassing. Yeah? I think there's an notational collision here. Here, Y star is supposed to be the productive potential of the economy. You can think of it as the Y that is cranked out in the production function, in the growth economics part of it. That this is what the economy's productive potential ought to be. Just as the natural rate of unemployment is what the unemployment rate ought to be if there aren't any big shocks producing either inflation or depression, one way or another. Okay. And let me see. We went over the income expenditure equation. Let me stress again that the income expenditure equation exists to make your life easier, that you do two steps. You add up those components of spending that don't depend on the level of real GDP and income and call them autonomous spending. You then perform these calculations with the behavioral parameters of how consumers and importers behave to get the multiplier. You then just multiply the multiplier by autonomous spending, and you get the level of real GDP. And suppose that you have investment spending at 1.7 trillion, gross exports at 1.7 trillion, G at 3 trillion, baseline consumption at 3 trillion. Suppose I give you the parameters of the consumption function and of the import function. What then is GDPY? And the way to do this is simply to write down the equation and then start plugging through by substituting things in. Start with the multiplier. Substitute a half for the marginal propensity to consume. Substitute in this case 0 for the tax rate. Substitute 1/6 for the marginal propensity to import. Notice that 1 minus 0 times 0.5 equals 0.5. That the marginal propensity to consume out of disposable income is also the share of each extra dollar of income that's spent on consumption because there are no taxes right here. Add together the terms in the bottom that are the multiplier. Take the multiplicative inverse. And you then see that 1.5 times autonomous spending is your level of real GDP. Multiply 1.5 by 3 plus 3 plus 1.7 plus 1.7, and you're left with your real GDP, with your real GDPY. And let's see how you can do. If you brought your iClickers, I'd like to see how this is going to go. With this as the underlying equation. Okay, let's see. 14.1 is A. That's correct. That's going to be the right answer. It's the right answer because you take your 9.4 trillion of autonomous spending and you multiply it by this multiplier of 1.5, and that's going to give you 14.1. The other is 6.3. That's dividing autonomous spending by 1.5. That's getting the multiplier turned upside down. It's called a multiplier because it multiplies. Right? It had better be 1, bigger than 1. That if your answer isn't bigger than autonomous spending, you're doing something wrong. And that's because this multiplier represents this positive feedback loop in the economy, according to which when income increases, households feel richer and spend more, and that puts people to work, and so income increases even more, which leads households to spend even more. Why is it important to know how to do this? Well, if you're named Christina Romer and you're a Berkeley economics professor who spent most of 2008 campaigning for Barack Obama, and you wind up in the White House in December 2008, it's very, very important indeed, because the president wants you to come up with an economic plan. And you've just taken your soundings of financial markets, and your best guess is that investment spending will be depressed by $400 billion a year for 3 years, and you're supposed to forecast how bad the recession is going to be so President Obama can start figuring out how to assemble a political coalition to do what's necessary. If you're Christy Romer, it's very important to be able to do this, accurately, and also to be able to do this at a much more sophisticated level that you get to in IAS 107. But still, it's the same basic model. It's more complicated calculations with lots more terms and lots more qualifications and lots of uncertainty, but the guts of it are the same as we have here. If you're not Christy Romer, it's considerably less important because you're not immediately working for the president and he's not asking for an answer tomorrow. But a bunch of you will wind up in jobs that require either that you forecast the economy or at least that you be able to ascertain whether forecasts handed to you make sense. and the ability to think back to this particular framework. When someone says, well, the economy is really going to boom next year, you should be able to ask them, oh yeah, why? Which of these components of autonomous spending do you think is going to grow a lot next year and why? And what do you think the multiplier is that together generate your forecast of a significant boom? Those are questions that you can't even ask if you don't have this framework in the back of your mind or aren't able to consult this framework. And yet if you can't ask those questions, you don't have much chance of figuring out whether you're a mushroom, right? Being kept in the dark in the basement and fed unhealthy things or not when people tell you what they think the future is going to bring. And you are all citizens sitting in judgment on the politicians you elect. And it's nice to be able to notice whether what they're saying makes sense or not. For example, the Republican Heritage Foundation yesterday came out with a report that claimed that the Republican budget proposal would reduce the unemployment rate to 2.8% by 2020, which instantly led to a huge chorus of criticism about just what do you imagine is going on with these components of autonomous spending that various budgetary manipulations by the government can push the unemployment rate down to 2.8%, so much so that the Heritage Foundation pulled back their report later on yesterday. Or the current government of Britain, arguing that a large cut in government purchases over the next 3 years is going to produce an economic boom. And they're at least going one step further. They're arguing that the cut in government purchases will trigger through a bunch of different channels a big boom in corporate investment. But when confronted with such an argument, you can say, okay, how big a boom in corporate investment? Where do you think it's coming from? Is it plausibly going to be larger than the cut in government purchases? If you understand this framework, you can be an informed citizen and an informed consumer of political rhetoric. And in general, I think we'll all be better off if we all are more informed consumers of political rhetoric. Investment savings. When is the investment savings version of this particular framework most useful? Well, let's once again go back to December 2008 and to the Obama administration's then forecast that after all the expansionary banking and monetary policies that are planned by the Federal Reserve take effect, that real GDP will still be depressed some $600 billion a year below its sustainable trend level for 3 years, and President Obama asks you to recommend a fiscal policy. Right? How much should you boost government purchases in the short run of the next 3 years, given that the economy is expected to fall into this big recession and near depression? And for that, that's what the investment savings version of the income expenditure model is good for. And once again, you have to make assumptions. What Christina Romer and Jared Bernstein, who did this, found, assuming after polling every single private forecaster they could find, was their parameters were roughly a marginal propensity to consume of 0.75, a tax rate at the margin of 0.333, and a marginal propensity to import of about 1/6. And they want to close a gap of $600 billion a year in output through fiscal policy. What do? That's what this equation is good for. And once again, you crank through it. You start by writing down the multiplier and the components of autonomous spending. You substitute in the parameters you know, the tax rate, the marginal propensity to consume, the marginal propensity to import, into the multiplier equation. Of course, if you're doing this for real, this is where almost all of the work is. What are these parameters? How confident they are what you think they are? What happens if you're wrong, if the parameters are significantly different? Like if, as Greg Mankiw thinks, the marginal propensity to consume is actually a bunch lower. But at your level, at my level too, actually, we just pick numbers out of the air and throw them in. And then you simply calculate this denominator, take its multiplicative inverse, and once again get 1.5. And because the only thing that you're thinking about varying among the components of autonomous spending is government purchases, you find that the change in output is 1.5 times the change in government purchases. So if you want to close a gap of $600 billion a year that you think will last for 3 years, assuming these parameter values, what then do you do? By how much do you propose to boost government purchases for? And for how long do you propose to boost them? Okay. And the answer I was looking for was indeed D. Yeah. $400 billion a year for 3 years. With a multiplier of 1.5, if you boost the economy by $400 billion in government purchases in each of those 3 years, the multiplier will take you the rest of the way back up to full employment. And then after 3 years, after the recession's gone, you won't have any leftover stimulus hanging over to push you into a situation of perhaps dangerous inflation, or at least destabilizing inflation. In actual fact, Rahm Emanuel, White House Chief of Staff, said $400 billion a year for 3 years is too much for Congress to swallow, that we won't be able to get the right wing of the Democratic coalition to go along with any number that's more than $1 trillion over a 3-year total, and certainly won't get Republicans on board. And we need Republicans. We need to get to 60 votes in the Senate. Larry Summers, head of the National Economic Council, also thought that $400 billion a year was too much, and he would rather have had a smaller stimulus that lasted for longer. Because he thought that our problems would be unlikely to be over in 3 years, back at the end of 2008. That this recession, because it was financial panic-caused recession, would likely be significantly longer than other earlier recessions, a factor which I don't think that Jared and Christie had fully incorporated into their particular models. And Larry also appears to have thought that at some point there's a danger in doing too much. If you do $400 billion a year and it turns out only $300 billion a year is necessary, then you've put yourself in a situation in which inflation is probably rising. And it's very dangerous for a Democratic government to be in a situation in which inflation is coming in higher than expected, because investors, workers, businesses won't trust a Democratic government to rein in inflation, and so inflation expectations will start up. I think Larry gets 1 point for saying this is likely to be a very long-term problem, and so we should plan for longer-term policies for just 3 years. I think he loses a point for saying that we should not aim to fill the entire output gap with fiscal policy. We would very much have liked to have a larger one. I don't know